Imagine you're standing on a factory floor in Bac Ninh province, northern Vietnam. It's March 2020. The air smells of industrial solvent, and the low hum of ventilation fans runs constant beneath every other sound. Around you, rows of workers in blue smocks are placing small white components into assembly trays. Earbuds, destined for Apple retail stores in 37 countries within the next 6 weeks. 2 years ago, this building was a rice paddy. The field it sits on was cleared and poured and built in 11 months. The workers assembling these earbuds trained on equipment that didn't exist in this province when they were teenagers. The supervisor running quality checks on the far end of the line is 26 years old. Nothing about this looks like a turning point in global trade. It looks like an ordinary shift. But the supply chain running through this building is physical evidence of one of the largest manufacturing redirections in 50 years. The specific, compounding set of forces that made this ordinary-looking factory floor possible has almost nothing to do with decisions made inside Vietnam. It starts with geography, a war that ended 2 generations ago, and a trap Vietnam is still working out how to escape. For 30 years, the default answer to "where does the world make things?" was China, not a country, a geographic law. At its peak, China was manufacturing roughly 28% of everything the world produces, more than the United States and Germany combined. The phrase "made in China" wasn't a label, it was an infrastructure verdict. The assumption embedded in every logistics model, every supply chain investment, every factory decision from the mid-1990s through the late 2010s was that this arrangement was stable. China had the workers, the infrastructure, the supplier networks, the institutional depth. Switching wasn't really a business option, it was a thought experiment for consultants with nothing better to do. Then 2018 happened. The US-China trade war didn't simply raise prices, it introduced something supply chains genuinely cannot absorb: uncertainty. A 25% tariff that can appear or disappear based on diplomatic negotiations running in real time isn't a cost, it's a category of exposure. Suddenly, the question in every boardroom wasn't whether China was the cheapest option. The question was how much of the company's operational risk was concentrated in a single geopolitical relationship. That's a different problem, and it required a different kind of answer. Most analysis of the Vietnam story misses something basic. Vietnam isn't cheap enough to replace China, not in any real sense. Chinese factory wages have risen sharply over 2 decades. But Chinese factories also carry 30-plus years of accumulated supplier ecosystems, logistics integration, and precision manufacturing capability built up across tens of thousands of specialized firms. For complex products, advanced semiconductors, precision optics, high-tolerance aerospace components, Vietnam doesn't have anything close to that industrial depth. The supplier networks don't exist. The material science institutions weren't built. The workforce wasn't trained. What Vietnam has instead is a geographic accident that turned out to fit the exact specifications of what nervous supply chain managers were shopping for. Look at a map of Southeast Asia. Vietnam's coastline runs 3,260 kilometers along the South China Sea, one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. Every major container route connecting East Asian production to US and European consumers passes near Vietnamese waters. The country has 3 major deep-water port clusters: Haiphong in the north, Da Nang in the center, Ho Chi Minh City in the south. Container ships departing Vietnamese ports can reach East Asian transshipment hubs in under 2 days, and US West Coast ports in roughly 12. The labor demographics add to this: 98 million people, median age around 30, near universal literacy, a workforce that isn't as cheap as China's was in 1995, but is considerably cheaper than China's is today and considerably younger than China's will be in 10 years. And there's one more factor that never shows up in official trade analysis but runs underneath every supply chain planning conversation. Vietnam has no active geopolitical dispute with Washington, no sanctions exposure, no export control debates, no political liability for a company trying to demonstrate to its shareholders that it's reducing China risk. For a multinational running a China Plus One diversification strategy, Vietnam doesn't just offer a manufacturing location. It offers one that doesn't carry the specific liability, making the current location problematic. That's not a coincidence. It's the result of geography and history colliding in a way nobody engineered, and it leads directly to what most people get wrong about this story. If geography and labor demographics were sufficient, Vietnam should have been running major global factories 20 years earlier. It wasn't. For most of the 20th century, Vietnam was the opposite of a manufacturing hub. The American War, which the Vietnamese call the American War, ended in 1975 after 2 decades of conflict that systematically targeted infrastructure: roads, bridges, railway lines, port facilities, industrial capacity. The physical base the country had before the war was largely destroyed. Reunification brought collectivized agriculture and nationalized industry. Then famine. Per capita income by 1986 was among the lowest in Asia, lower than many sub-Saharan African economies. The government implemented Doi Moi renovation in 1986, not from ideological conversion, but from a practical reckoning that the existing system was failing. Private farming, private enterprise, foreign investment, admitted cautiously. The economy responded faster than the architects of the policy expected. By the mid-1990s, Vietnam was one of the fastest-growing economies in the region. Foreign manufacturers arrived, initially from Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. Nike sourced its first Vietnamese products in 1995. Samsung built its first Vietnamese plant in 2008. The garment factories, the shoe factories, the basic electronics assembly lines all came. But the manufacturing that arrived in those early decades sat at the bottom of the complexity ladder. Stitching, assembly, final stage processing. Vietnam was useful, a source of cheap labor at the fringe of global supply chains, but China remained the axis. The architecture of global production didn't reorganize around Vietnam. Vietnam just picked up the overflow. Nobody talks about what happened next. What happened next was that China started changing in ways that made the overflow valve more important. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, Chinese factory wages were rising by roughly 10% annually. Environmental regulations were tightening in ways that raised costs for manufacturers. The Chinese government's industrial policy was explicitly repositioning the country up the value chain toward semiconductors, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing. Low-margin assembly work that had anchored China's manufacturing dominance for 20 years was becoming economically and politically inconvenient for Beijing as much as for the companies doing it. Simultaneously, China's one-child policy, in effect from 1980 to 2015, was creating a demographic cliff visible in the data decades in advance. The workforce entering factories in the 2030s was already by the 2010s measurably smaller than the workforce of the 2010s. The labor supply that made the original China manufacturing story possible was contracting. Supply chain managers knew all of this. They modeled it. Most concluded that diversification was theoretically desirable and practically prohibitive. The switching costs were too high. The supplier network investment was too deep, the dependency was too structural. Then the tariffs landed, and theoretically desirable became operationally urgent. What the 2018 tariff schedule did wasn't force companies out of China. It moved specific categories of manufacturing, labor-intensive, tariff-sensitive, lower-complexity assembly, across a cost threshold where the previously prohibitive switching cost suddenly became acceptable. Vietnam happened to be sitting on the other side of that threshold. Ready? In the narrow sense that matters. Ports functional, labor available, government eager, no political liability. Samsung expanded Vietnamese operations until the country now produces roughly half its global smartphone output. Apple shifted AirPod and iPad manufacturing to Vietnamese contract manufacturers. Intel, LG, Canon, Foxconn, Nike. The announcement cadence was quarterly. Vietnam received more foreign direct investment in 2023 than it had in any 5-year period before 2015. A country the size of California now accounts for approximately 8% of U.S. electronics imports. If the map of this shift makes sense so far, hit like, because what comes next is where it gets genuinely complicated. The success story leaves something out. Most of what Vietnam assembles still isn't Vietnamese. Take a Samsung phone manufactured in Bac Ninh province. The display comes from South Korea, the processor from Taiwan, camera components from Japan, the connectors, the battery materials, the specialized adhesives and industrial films. A significant share of inputs still arrives from Chinese suppliers in Guangdong and Jiangsu. The Vietnamese factory contributes the final assembly step, the workers, the building, the last sequence of operations before the box is sealed and the label reads, "Made in Vietnam." That label matters enormously under international trade law. The doctrine of substantial transformation, the legal standard that determines country of origin for tariff purposes, generally awards the designation to wherever the final significant manufacturing step occurs. A product assembled in Vietnam is Vietnamese, regardless of where its inputs originated. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What percentage of Vietnam's manufacturing boom represents genuine economic diversification, and what percentage is a tariff jurisdiction reclassification of production that still fundamentally runs through China? The Vietnamese government has been asking the same question. U.S. customs authorities have escalated scrutiny of Vietnamese exports twice since 2018, in 2019 and again in 2023, specifically investigating transshipment patterns. Vietnamese exports to the U.S., where Chinese input content exceeded what the documented Vietnamese industrial capacity could plausibly consume. In several product categories, more was leaving Vietnamese ports than could have been manufactured inside them. This is the take that'll probably earn some pushback. The China Plus One strategy, as actually implemented by most companies, isn't diversification. It's geographic arbitrage on a tariff framework written before supply chains became this distributed and this layered. A phone assembled in Hanoi from components sourced in Shenzhen is still a phone whose supply chain runs through Shenzhen. The geopolitical exposure hasn't been eliminated. It's been rerouted and relabeled. What do you think? Is Vietnam building a real industrial foundation here? Or is it running a sophisticated relay race for Chinese manufacturing that hasn't actually moved anywhere? What this case reveals, more than the Vietnam story itself, is how manufacturing capacity actually moves between countries. Supply chains don't relocate, they branch. When companies say they're reducing China exposure, they usually mean they're maintaining Chinese operations while building parallel capacity elsewhere. The Chinese factories still exist. The Chinese supplier networks still run. The additional Vietnamese capacity handles the portion of production that's tariff-sensitive or politically visible. China Plus One isn't a replacement strategy. It's an insurance policy written on top of an existing dependency. The branching happens fastest where geography cooperates, coastlines, port depth, labor availability, political profile. Vietnam fit that specification in a particular moment of disruption. But fit for the moment isn't the same as industrial capability. What the world's most successful manufacturing economies actually built, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, eventually China itself, wasn't factories. It was the dense ecosystem that makes factories possible and makes them improve over time. Supplier networks where the fifth-tier component supplier is 10 kilometers from the assembly plant. Materials science institutions where the problems of manufacturing at scale get solved through research. Vocational pipelines that produce skilled machinists and process engineers at the volume that industry actually needs. The institutional memory that accumulates when a country makes the same product in increasingly refined form for 50 years. One detail that stuck with me in researching this: Vietnam currently ranks around 70th globally in the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index. China ranks 26th. That gap isn't about ports or coastlines, both countries have those. It's about power grid reliability in secondary cities, supplier density in mid-tier industrial zones, road and rail connectivity between inland provinces and coastal terminals. Those things don't get built in a 5-year investment cycle. They compound over decades. The countries that made this transition successfully before, South Korea in the 1970s, Taiwan in the 1980s, China from the 1990s onward, all passed through a phase of assembly before they became manufacturers, and manufacturers before they became designers. South Korean electronics companies assembled Japanese components before they designed their own. Taiwanese contract manufacturers built other people's hardware before they engineered their own supply chains. Chinese factories assembled foreign products before Chinese firms started acquiring the supplier relationships and the design capability. Vietnam is in the assembly phase right now. Whether it exits that phase and at what speed depends on decisions being made in industrial policy offices and education ministries across northern Vietnam right now. Decisions about technical university enrollment rates, about supplier development requirements in special economic zones, about infrastructure spending in inland provinces. Those decisions won't make international headlines. They'll show up in import data 15 years from now. If you want to follow how this unfolds, subscribe. The mechanisms running underneath the headlines are what actually determine which countries inherit manufacturing capacity. Go back to that factory floor in Bac Ninh. The building has expanded twice since 2020. The woman who farmed the rice paddy that land used to be works 3 shifts away now in a different facility, assembling components for a product she can't identify, for a brand she's never seen a storefront for, going to a country she has no immediate plans to visit. Her daughter enrolled in an engineering program last year. That's the actual signal underneath the trade war headlines and the tariff schedules and the diplomatic statements about supply chain resilience. The question isn't whether Vietnam can become the next China. It can't, and the scale comparison is a category error. China's manufacturing dominance was built by 1 billion people over 4 decades. The question is what Vietnam becomes on the other side of this moment, whether the foreign factories currently landing there become the seed of an industrial ecosystem, the way Japanese and South Korean investment seeded Taiwanese electronics and Taiwanese investment helped build Chinese manufacturing depth, or whether Vietnam ends up as a sophisticated assembly location that global supply chains flow through without ever really stopping. That answer is still being written. In about 15 years, the export complexity data will tell us which one it was. Comment below. Is Vietnam building something permanent, or is this just the latest address on a supply chain that never actually changed?